Did medieval women only tend to gardens and birth children? Were they silent figures in a man's world without power or voice from the 5th to the 15th century? The truth might just shock you. Number 11. All medieval women were universally oppressed and powerless. Many people imagine medieval women living lives of constant oppression, stripped of all agency and power. This widespread belief paints a bleak picture of every woman from peasant to queen, suggesting a monolithic experience of helplessness across 1,000 years of history. However, the medieval era was a complex tapestry, and the experiences of women varied immensely based on their social class, geographical location, marital status, and even individual personality. Historical records reveal a far more nuanced reality, where women held various forms of power and exerted significant influence in their communities and beyond. Peasant women, for instance, were vital to the agricultural economy. They worked alongside men in the fields, planting, harvesting, and tending livestock. Their labor was essential for survival, and their contributions were not seen as supplementary but as fundamental to the household's sustenance. The records from manorial courts across England show women frequently participating in legal proceedings. They brought cases against neighbors, defended their rights to land, and even served as witnesses or jurors in certain village matters. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, lists women as landowners and tenants in their own right, demonstrating their economic standing and legal recognition in early medieval England. Some village women managed entire households, including brewing ale, baking bread, and making textiles, often selling surplus goods in local markets. Their economic activities provided crucial income and gave them a degree of autonomy within their immediate communities. In urban centers, women engaged in a wide array of trades and crafts. They worked as merchants, shopkeepers, weavers, dyers, brewers, innkeepers, and apothecaries. City records from places like Paris, London, and Florence detail numerous women running successful businesses, sometimes independently and sometimes in partnership with their husbands. A Florentine tax census from the 1420s lists many women as heads of households and taxpayers, indicating their financial independence and economic power. In Cologne, Germany, women were prominent in the textile industry, and records show they held property, controlled their own finances, and managed apprentices. The existence of female-headed guilds in some cities, such as the silk weavers in Paris or the embroiderers in London, further highlights women's active participation and leadership in the urban economy. These guilds often set quality standards, regulated trade, and provided social support for their members. Noblewomen, while often subject to arranged marriages, were not mere pawns. They wielded considerable power within their vast estates. A lady of the manor managed the household economy, overseeing servants, finances, and agricultural production, especially when her husband was away at war or on pilgrimage. She often acted as a regent, governing territories and administering justice in her husband's absence. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen of France and later England in the 12th century, was a powerful political figure who actively participated in crusades, influenced royal policy, and even led armies. Her court was a center of culture and patronage, fostering the development of troubadour poetry and chivalric ideals. Similarly, Blanche of Castile, Queen Regent of France in the 13th century, skillfully ruled the kingdom during her son Louis IX's minority, successfully suppressing rebellions and negotiating treaties. Women like Matilda of Tuscany in the 11th century commanded their own armies and played a crucial role in the investiture controversy, a major political struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. These examples demonstrate that women, particularly those of high social standing, could exert significant political and military influence, challenging the notion of universal powerlessness. Even within the religious sphere, women found avenues for authority and influence. Abbesses of powerful convents controlled vast lands, managed extensive financial resources, and held spiritual authority over large communities of nuns and lay people. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and visionary. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering advice and critiques. Her intellectual and spiritual authority was widely recognized throughout Europe. Other notable abbesses, such as Heloise in 12th century France or Saint Scholastica in early medieval Italy, were figures of immense respect and spiritual guidance, overseeing communities that were often centers of learning and artistic production. Their leadership roles within powerful institutions demonstrate a form of power that extended far beyond the domestic sphere. The concept of power itself needs careful consideration in the medieval context. While direct political power might have been less accessible to women in general, influence, economic control, and social standing were all forms of power that many women exercised. Patronage of the arts, management of estates, participation in legal and economic life, and spiritual leadership all indicate that women were active agents in their own lives and in the broader society. The idea that all women were simply oppressed and powerless ignores the diverse realities of medieval life and the numerous ways women contributed to and shaped their world. Records from numerous medieval towns and villages show women filing lawsuits, witnessing documents, and owning property, activities that require legal recognition and agency. These documented actions present a counter-narrative to the idea of complete powerlessness. Number 10. Medieval women had no legal rights. A common misconception is that medieval women possessed no legal rights whatsoever, existing solely under the complete control of their fathers or husbands. This idea paints a picture of women as mere chattel, unable to own property, enter contracts, or participate in legal processes. However, a close examination of medieval legal systems, though patriarchal in nature, reveals a complex framework where women did possess certain rights, particularly concerning property, inheritance, and even their ability to participate in legal proceedings. The specific legal rights often varied significantly depending on the region, social class, and the woman's marital status. In England, common law traditions, while favoring male heirs, still recognized certain rights for women. A widow, for example, had a legal right to dower, which entitled her to a life interest in 1/3 of her deceased husband's land. This meant she could live off the income from that land for the rest of her life, even if the property eventually passed to male heirs. This dower right provided a crucial form of economic security for widows and allowed them a degree of independence. The court rolls of medieval England show numerous cases where widows successfully defended their dower rights against challenges from male relatives. For instance, the pipe rolls of the 12th and 13th centuries contain entries detailing fines paid by individuals attempting to deprive widows of their rightful dower, indicating that these rights were legally enforceable. Single women, or feme souls, held even more extensive rights. An unmarried woman over the age of majority, typically 12 or 14, though varying by region, was considered legally independent. She could own property, enter into contracts, sue and be sued in court, and even conduct business in her own name. City charters and guild regulations from towns like London, Bristol, and York frequently referred to feme souls operating businesses independently. The Court of Husting records in London, for example, show countless instances of unmarried women buying, selling, and bequeathing property. These women had full legal capacity to manage their financial affairs and participate in the urban economy without male guardianship. Married women, or femmes coverts, faced more restrictions under common law, as their legal identity was largely subsumed under that of their husband. However, this did not mean they had no rights. While a married woman generally could not sue or be sued without her husband, exceptions existed, particularly in urban areas. In many towns, a custom known as feme sole trader allowed married women who ran businesses independently to be treated as feme souls for the purpose of their trade. This meant they could incur debts and be sued in their own name regarding their business activities, thereby acknowledging their separate economic identity. Records from medieval London city courts document many such cases, showcasing married women engaging in significant commercial transactions. In other parts of Europe, different legal systems offered women distinct rights. In parts of medieval Germany and Scandinavia, women often had stronger inheritance rights to both movable and immovable property, even when married. Germanic customary law, for example, often allowed daughters to inherit equally with sons in the absence of a male heir, and sometimes even alongside them. Scandinavian laws also granted women significant property rights and the ability to control their own dowries. The legal codes from the Lombard Kingdom in Italy indicate that women could own land and administer their own property. These examples demonstrate that legal traditions outside of English common law often provided women with a broader range of legal autonomy. Women also participated directly in legal processes. They appeared as plaintiffs and defendants in court, particularly in cases involving property disputes, debts, and defamation. Manorial court rolls, local borough court records, and even royal court documents contain evidence of women testifying, bringing complaints, and seeking justice. Women served as witnesses, took oaths, and engaged in legal strategies to protect their interests. For example, records from the Court of Arches, an ecclesiastical court in England, reveal women frequently initiating cases related to marriage, divorce, and slander. These appearances required a clear understanding of legal procedures and the ability to articulate their claims effectively. The concept of dowry and dower also illustrates women's legal standing regarding property. A dowry was property or money brought by a bride to her husband upon marriage, which often remained her property or was managed for her benefit. A dower, as mentioned, was the provision made for a widow from her husband's property. These legal mechanisms show that women were not simply property but were associated with substantial economic assets, and their claims to these assets were recognized and protected by law, even if enforcement sometimes required legal action. While the legal landscape was undoubtedly gendered and hierarchical, the idea that medieval women had no legal rights is an oversimplification that ignores the numerous ways they engaged with, and benefited from, the legal systems of their time. Number 9. Medieval women were entirely uneducated and illiterate. The prevailing image of medieval women often suggests they were universally uneducated, unable to read or write, and confined to purely domestic or manual tasks. This myth implies a widespread illiteracy that kept women intellectually marginalized and excluded from literate culture. However, historical evidence from various social strata and regions reveals a more complex reality. While formal education was certainly not as widespread as it is today, many medieval women, from queens to nuns to urban craftswomen, possessed various levels of literacy and actively participated in intellectual and artistic pursuits. For noblewomen, education was often an important part of their upbringing, especially those destined to manage large estates or hold positions of political influence. They were frequently taught to read and write, not only for practical purposes of administration and correspondence, but also for religious devotion and cultural enrichment. Young noblewomen would be educated by tutors, chaplains, or in convents. They studied Latin, French, and sometimes other languages, alongside subjects like history, arithmetic, music, and the arts. Christine de Pizan, a prominent 14th century writer, described her own extensive education at the French court, emphasizing the importance of learning for women of her social standing. Queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile, were known for their patronage of literature and their own intellectual capabilities, suggesting they were well versed in the literary traditions of their time. Books on household management, religious instruction, and even chivalric romances were part of a noblewoman's library, indicating their engagement with written culture. Convents served as significant centers of female learning throughout the medieval period. Nuns, by definition, needed to be literate to read the divine office, the Bible, and other religious texts. Beyond basic literacy, many convents provided advanced education in theology, Latin, music, history, and even scientific subjects. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, were renowned scholars, composers, and writers whose works on theology, medicine, and natural history were widely circulated and respected. Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century German canoness, wrote Latin plays and poems, making her one of the earliest known female dramatists in the Western world. These women and their communities often maintained scriptoria where manuscripts were copied, illuminated, and sometimes composed, demonstrating a high level of literary activity and intellectual engagement within female monastic institutions. Even among urban middle-class women, a degree of literacy was not uncommon, especially for those involved in trade or business. Their wives of merchants, craftswomen, and shopkeepers often needed to keep accounts, manage inventories, and correspond with suppliers or customers. Guild records and city documents sometimes show women signing their names or making marks in a way that suggests a functional literacy necessary for their professions. For example, records from medieval London indicate that wives and daughters of tradesmen often assisted in business, a role that would benefit from literacy for record-keeping and basic correspondence. The proliferation of private letters and personal devotional books for lay audiences also suggests a broader base of literacy than often assumed, extending beyond the nobility and clergy. While complete literacy was not universal, as it was not for men either, the ability to read was more common among women than previously believed, particularly in the later Middle Ages. The increasing availability of vernacular texts, rather than solely Latin, made reading more accessible to a wider population, including women. Many women owned devotional books, such as Books of Hours, which contained prayers, psalms, and calendars, and were clearly intended for personal use and spiritual instruction. The detailed illuminations in these books often depicted women actively reading and praying, reinforcing the idea of female literacy. Furthermore, education for women was not limited to formal schooling. The girls learned practical skills like spinning, weaving, cooking, and household management, which were crucial for daily life and economic survival. These skills were taught within the family or through apprenticeship systems, providing a form of vocational education essential for their roles in society. While not academic in the modern sense, this practical knowledge was vital for the functioning of medieval households and economies. The assertion that medieval women were entirely uneducated ignores these varied forms of learning and the significant intellectual contributions made by many women throughout the period. Records of women's wills often list books as prized possessions, demonstrating their value and use within female households. These historical details present a rich tapestry of female education that challenges the simplified myth. Number 8, medieval women were confined to the domestic sphere. The idea that medieval women were strictly confined to their homes, with their lives revolving solely around child-rearing and household chores, is a pervasive myth. This viewpoint suggests that women rarely ventured beyond their immediate domestic surroundings and had little involvement in public life or economic activity outside the family unit. However, historical evidence demonstrates that medieval women across various social classes were active participants in the public sphere, engaged in diverse forms of labor, commerce, and social interaction that frequently took them beyond the confines of their dwellings. Peasant women, who constituted the vast majority of the population, worked extensively outside the home. Their labor was indispensable for the survival of their families and the agrarian economy. They worked in the fields alongside men, performing arduous tasks such as plowing, planting, harvesting, and threshing. Manorial records and agricultural treatises frequently describe women's roles in various seasonal agricultural activities. Beyond the fields, they also tended livestock, gathered firewood, fetched water from communal wells, and worked in village industries like brewing and baking. These activities regularly took them into communal spaces, villages, markets, and the surrounding countryside. Their lives were deeply integrated into the public spaces of their rural communities, rather than being isolated within their cottages. In medieval towns and cities, women were highly visible in the marketplace and commercial life. They were not just consumers, but active producers and sellers. Women operated market stalls, selling surplus produce from their gardens, dairy products, eggs, and crafts like textiles or pottery. They were frequently innkeepers, managing taverns and guest houses that served as important social hubs. Many women ran their own shops as bakers, brewers, butchers, chandlers, and apothecaries. The cries of London, a common street scene, often featured women hawking their wares directly to customers. City ordinances and guild regulations across Europe mention women's involvement in trade and their right to conduct business in public spaces. For example, records from the city of Florence show women running successful silk workshops and other manufacturing enterprises. These women's livelihoods depended on interacting with customers, suppliers, and fellow merchants in the public squares and commercial streets of the city. Beyond labor and commerce, women participated in public life through religious and social activities. They attended church services, religious processions, and pilgrimages, which were significant public gatherings. Women were active members of confraternities and guilds, which served as social, charitable, and religious organizations, often holding meetings and events in public spaces. Records of guild festivities and processions reveal women participating alongside men, sometimes in prominent roles. For example, records from the London Drapers Company in the 14th century show women involved in the company's banquets and charitable work. These activities extended their social networks beyond the immediate family and integrated them into the broader community. Even noblewomen, despite their privileged status, were not entirely confined to their castles. While they oversaw domestic staff and managed household affairs, they also traveled extensively, accompanying their husbands on campaigns, pilgrimages, or diplomatic missions. They received visitors, held court, and participated in public ceremonies. Queens and noblewomen often served as regents when their husbands were absent or during the minority of their sons, taking on direct political and administrative responsibilities that placed them squarely in the public eye. Examples, like Eleanor of Aquitaine leading an army on crusade, or Blanche of Castile ruling France, demonstrate noblewomen operating on a grand public stage. They engaged in diplomacy, oversaw justice, and commanded military forces, all of which required their presence in public forums and official settings. While the domestic sphere was certainly important for women, it was not a boundary that isolated them from the rest of society. The household itself was often a place of production, not just consumption, and its activities frequently spilled over into public spaces. The medieval world was largely an outdoor world, with much of life happening in fields, market streets, and communal areas. Women were integral to these public activities, whether through their labor, their commerce, or their social and religious participation. The idea of women being confined misses the dynamism and pervasive presence of women in all aspects of medieval public life. Records from village courts show women frequently attending and participating in communal decision-making, further challenging the myth of confinement. Number 7, medieval women were seen purely as property. The belief that medieval women were universally viewed and treated as mere property, devoid of individual identity or agency, is a persistent misconception. This myth suggests that women were exchanged like commodities, with no rights over their own bodies or decisions, and that their worth was solely determined by their material value to men. However, While women's status was often intertwined with property and marriage, historical evidence demonstrates that they were recognized as individuals with legal standing, spiritual significance, and personal identities that extended beyond mere possession. Marriage contracts and dowry agreements, often cited as evidence of women being property, actually tell a more complex story. A dowry, which was property or money brought by the bride to her husband, was intended to be her contribution to the marital household and often remained her legal property or was managed for her benefit. It was a form of security for the wife, especially in the case of widowhood or divorce. The dower, a portion of the husband's land set aside for his wife's maintenance if she became a widow, further protected her economic independence. These provisions indicate that women were not simply acquired, but were provided for and had legal claims to assets. For instance, detailed dowry contracts from medieval Italy show meticulous inventories of goods and money explicitly designated as the wife's property, managed by her husband but legally distinct from his own assets. While arranged marriages were common, particularly among the nobility, the concept of consent was still important in medieval canon law, which governed marriage. For a marriage to be legally binding in the eyes of the church, both the man and the woman had to freely consent. While societal pressures and familial expectations were immense, forced marriages were technically invalid. Ecclesiastical court records from various European regions contain cases where individuals sought annulment on the grounds of lack of consent, demonstrating that the church upheld the principle of free will in marital unions. For example, records from the Archbishop of Canterbury's court in the 14th century show annulment proceedings initiated by women who claimed they had been coerced into marriage, with some cases resulting in successful annulments. Women's legal standing as individuals is also evident in their ability to own and inherit property, particularly as single women or widows. As previously discussed, a feme sole could enter into contracts, sue and be sued, and manage her own finances without male guardianship. Widows often inherited significant property and managed estates independently, sometimes for decades. The wills and testaments from the medieval period frequently show women bequeathing property, money, and personal items to their chosen heirs, demonstrating their right to dispose of their assets as they saw fit. For example, numerous wills from the City of London in the 13th and 14th centuries clearly list women as property owners, making detailed bequests. Beyond legal frameworks, women's individual identities were acknowledged in various cultural and religious contexts. In religious thought, women were considered souls equal to men in the eyes of God, capable of salvation and spiritual grace. Female saints, mystics, and religious figures like Catherine of Siena or Bridget of Sweden held immense spiritual authority and commanded widespread respect, demonstrating that a woman's value was not solely tied to her physical or material utility. Their writings and visions were revered, and their counsel sought by powerful men. In literature and art, while often idealized or constrained by gender roles, women were depicted as individuals with distinct personalities, virtues, and flaws. Courtly love literature, while a fantasy, elevated women to a position of admiration and influence, portraying them as figures of beauty, intellect, and moral authority. Portraits and effigies of noble women on tombs or in manuscripts often depicted them with symbols of their individuality, status, and piety, rather than as interchangeable commodities. These representations, though selective, offer a glimpse into a recognition of individual female identity. While medieval society was hierarchical and patriarchal, the idea that women were purely property is an oversimplification. They possessed legal rights, particularly regarding property and consent, were recognized as individuals in religious doctrine, and held personal and social identities that went beyond mere material possession. The legal and social structures of the time, while restrictive, did not fully erase women's personhood or agency. The complexity of women's roles and status challenges the reductionist view of them as mere chattel. Number 6, medieval women could not own or run businesses. The notion that medieval women were entirely excluded from economic life, unable to own property, run businesses, or engage in commerce independently, is a widespread misconception. This myth often portrays medieval society as one where the marketplace and all forms of trade were exclusively male domains. However, historical records, guild documents, and urban regulations from across medieval Europe demonstrate that women were deeply involved in a wide array of economic activities, frequently owning, managing, and operating their own businesses. In urban centers, women were vital to the local economy. They ran shops, market stalls, and workshops, engaging in diverse trades. The records from cities like London, Paris, and Florence show women working as bakers, brewers, milliners, cloth merchants, fishmongers, apothecaries, and innkeepers. For example, the Liber Albus, a collection of London's laws and customs, details many instances of women participating in trade. A substantial number of brewing businesses were run by women known as brewsters, who were responsible for providing a staple drink for the population. Tax records from medieval towns often list women as independent taxpayers and business owners, indicating their economic autonomy and legal recognition. Many women operated businesses as feme souls, or single women, including widows, who had full legal capacity to enter into contracts, incur debts, and manage their enterprises independently. The wills of many medieval women frequently reveal their ownership of business property, tools, and stock, which they bequeath to their heirs or associates. For instance, wills from 14th century York list women owning bakehouses, brewing equipment, and parcels of land from which they derived income. These documents provide direct evidence of their entrepreneurial activities and ownership of significant assets. Married women also played crucial roles in business, often working alongside their husbands or managing affairs when their husbands were away. In some cities, particularly in England, a legal custom known as feme sole trader allowed married women who independently ran a trade to be treated legally as if they were single. This meant they could sue and be sued in matters related to their business without involving their husbands, a significant recognition of their distinct economic identity. Court records from the Mayor's Court in London often show cases involving women engaging in complex commercial disputes, reflecting their active participation in the city's economy. Women were also active in guilds, which were powerful organizations that regulated trades, protected members' interests, and provided social support. While some guilds were predominantly male, many admitted women as members, particularly in crafts like weaving, silk production, and embroidery. In Paris, for example, the Silk Weavers Guild was primarily composed of women, who held leadership positions and set regulations for their trade. In other guilds, women inherited their husband's guild membership upon widowhood, allowing them to continue operating the family business. Records from the Mercers and Drapers Guilds in London show women participating as full members or holding significant roles within the guild structure. Beyond urban trades, women in rural areas also engaged in independent economic activities. They spun and wove textiles, produced dairy products, raised poultry, and cultivated small plots of land, often selling their surplus goods at local markets. These activities provided crucial supplementary income for their families and gave them a degree of economic independence. Manorial court rules occasionally mention women being fined for infractions related to their market activities, such as selling substandard goods or breaking regulations, which paradoxically demonstrates their active participation in commerce. The idea that medieval women were absent from the world of business overlooks the practical realities of a society where household and economic life were deeply intertwined. Many homes also served as workshops or shops, blurring the lines between domestic and commercial spheres. Women's skills and labor were essential to the functioning of local economies, and their entrepreneurial spirit is well documented in historical records. From managing large agricultural estates to running small urban shops, medieval women were active, independent, and often successful business owners. The evidence clearly demonstrates that many women held significant economic power and actively shaped the commercial landscape of their communities. Number 5. All medieval marriages were forced, without consent. A prevalent myth about medieval women is that all marriages were entirely forced upon them by their families, with no regard for personal choice or consent. This narrative often conjures images of young women being compelled into unions for economic or political gain, with no say in their own future. While arranged marriages were indeed common, particularly among the aristocracy, and societal pressures were immense, the idea that consent was universally absent is inaccurate. Medieval canon law, which governed marriage throughout Christian Europe, explicitly required the consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid, and historical records show that women sometimes exercised this right, even against their families' wishes. The Catholic Church considered marriage a sacrament, and its validity hinged on the free and public consent of both the bride and the groom. According to the influential legal texts of Gratian's Decretum in the 12th century, a marriage could not exist without the explicit fiat or I do from both individuals. This meant that a forced union, even if blessed by a priest, was technically invalid under canon law. Ecclesiastical courts, which handled marriage disputes, frequently heard cases brought by individuals, including women, seeking annulments on the grounds of lack of consent. For example, records from the courts of the Archbishop of York in the 14th century contain multiple instances of women testifying that they were coerced into marriage, sometimes successfully obtaining annulments. While noble families often negotiated marriages based on alliances, land, or wealth, the actual ceremony still required the bride's public affirmation. While a young woman might feel immense pressure to agree, the legal framework acknowledged her right to refuse. Stories of women resisting unwanted unions, even if rare, exist in chronicles and legal records. For instance, the case of Margaret Paston in the 15th century, who resisted a proposed marriage, illustrates that even within powerful families, women sometimes voiced their dissent, sometimes successfully delaying or preventing a union. Among the lower classes, marriages were often less about grand alliances and more about practical considerations like shared labor and the establishment of a new household. While parental approval was important, young people in peasant communities often had more autonomy in choosing partners, especially as they aged. Court records from manorial villages sometimes indicate betrothals or spousal agreements made informally between couples, later formalized with parental blessing. These agreements, though not legally binding until consummation or formal vows, show a degree of self-determination in forming relationships. The concept of love in marriage, though different from modern romantic notions, was not entirely absent. While not the primary driver for all marriages, especially for the elite, companionship, affection, and mutual respect were often hoped for outcomes. Letters and personal accounts from the later Middle Ages sometimes express affection between spouses, suggesting that marriages, even if arranged, could develop into loving partnerships. The Livre de Lis by Christine de Pizan, a 15th century writer, discusses the virtues of good marriage and companionship, reflecting contemporary ideals. Furthermore, the Church allowed for divorce in certain circumstances, such as consanguinity being too closely related or non-consummation, and it also recognized legal separations. These legal avenues, while limited, offered women and men a means to escape intolerable unions. The existence of these options, alongside the requirement for consent, challenges the idea of absolute and inescapable forced marriages. While it is true that many medieval women, particularly those of higher status, had limited choice in their marriage partners due to familial and societal pressures, the notion that all marriages were forced without any form of consent is an oversimplification. The legal and religious framework of the time explicitly required consent, and historical evidence shows that women were sometimes able to exercise this right, asserting their agency in a crucial life decision. The nuance of medieval marriage practices reveals a system where consent, though often under duress, was a recognized and necessary component. Number 4. Mass witch burnings defined the medieval experience for women. One of the most persistent and misleading myths about medieval women is the idea that the Middle Ages were a period of widespread mass witch burnings, with countless women accused and executed as witches. This imagery, often fueled by popular culture, paints a terrifying picture of an era defined by fear and persecution of women. However, historical research clearly demonstrates that the extensive witch hunts and mass executions commonly associated with this myth primarily occurred after the medieval period, predominantly in the early modern era, from the late 15th century through the 17th century. The medieval period itself saw very few accusations of witchcraft and even fewer executions. Throughout the majority of the Middle Ages, from roughly the 5th to the late 15th century, belief in witchcraft certainly existed, but it was generally viewed as a form of minor superstition or heresy, not as a widespread satanic conspiracy. The Church's official stance, articulated in texts like the Canon Episcopi circulated from the 10th century, largely dismissed beliefs in actual witches flying or transforming into animals as illusions, mere deceptions by the devil, rather than real powers wielded by individuals. Early medieval laws and ecclesiastical pronouncements focused more on penitence for engaging in superstitious practices rather than on prosecuting individuals as practitioners of malicious magic. When accusations of witchcraft did arise in the medieval period, they were usually isolated incidents, often linked to accusations of poisoning or harmful magic. The legal processes were generally more restrained than the later witch hunts. Accusations were typically handled in local secular courts or ecclesiastical courts, and proof was usually required, often through testimony. The confessions extracted through torture, common in the later witch hunts, were much less prevalent or legally sanctioned in the medieval period, especially before the rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century. Even then, the Inquisition primarily focused on religious heresy, not witchcraft as a widespread phenomenon. Actual executions for witchcraft in the medieval era were exceedingly rare. When they did occur, they were usually for specific acts of maleficent harmful magic that were proven to cause death or injury, rather than for a pact with the devil or widespread satanic worship. The punishment for such acts, if proven, was often hanging or beheading, not burning, which was typically reserved for heresy and treason. For example, the first recorded execution for witchcraft in England occurred in 1441, but this was an isolated case and not part of a broader pattern of persecution. The trials of Dame Alice Kyteler in Ireland in 1324 are often cited, but her case was exceptional for its time, involving complex political and ecclesiastical struggles, and she herself escaped, though one of her associates was burned as a relapsed heretic. The true explosion of witch trials, often accompanied by torture, mass accusations, and executions by burning, began in earnest in the late 15th century and reached its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries. This period, known as the early modern era, saw the development of new theological ideas about witchcraft as a pact with the devil, the publication of influential witch-hunting manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum 1487, and the rise of secular courts with broader powers to prosecute suspected witches. The vast majority of the tens of thousands of people accused and executed for witchcraft across Europe, estimated to be around 40,000 to 50,000, occurred during this later period, not the medieval one. Women were indeed disproportionately targeted during these early modern witch hunts, often comprising 75 to 85% of those accused. Therefore, attributing mass witch burnings to the medieval era is a historical inaccuracy. While medieval people certainly had beliefs about magic and superstition, the systematic and widespread persecution of witches on a large scale is a phenomenon of the subsequent centuries. The medieval experience for women, while challenging in many ways, was not defined by the pervasive fear of being accused and burned as a witch. The historical evidence points to a distinctly different period and legal context for the infamous witch trials. Number 3, medieval women had no influence in religion outside of being nuns. The idea that medieval women's religious lives were strictly limited to the cloister, with nuns being the only women of significant religious influence, is a narrow and inaccurate portrayal. This myth implies that laywomen had little agency or impact in religious life, being mere passive recipients of spiritual guidance. However, historical evidence reveals that women, outside of monastic orders, played diverse and vital roles in medieval religious practice, holding spiritual authority, promoting piety, and actively shaping devotional culture in ways that extended far beyond the convent walls. Laywomen were deeply involved in parish life. They attended Mass, participated in sacraments, and contributed to the upkeep of churches through donations and voluntary labor. Church wardens' accounts from medieval England often record women contributing funds, vestments, or labor for church repairs and adornments. They were active in confraternities and guilds, which were religious brotherhoods or sisterhoods that provided mutual aid, organized processions, and performed charitable works. These organizations, open to both men and women, were significant centers of communal religious life. And women often held leadership positions within female-specific confraternities or were active members in mixed-gender ones, organizing charitable endeavors, masses, and social gatherings. Many medieval laywomen became influential patrons of religious institutions. Wealthy noblewomen frequently founded monasteries, nunneries, chapels, and hospitals, or endowed existing ones with significant lands and funds. This patronage gave them considerable influence over the institutions they supported, allowing them to appoint abbesses, select chaplains, and even shape the liturgical practices within their foundations. For example, Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, founded the Franciscan Friary at Langley and supported numerous religious houses in the 14th century, demonstrating her active role in shaping religious institutions. Such patronage was not merely passive donation, but an active engagement in the spiritual economy of the time. Perhaps the most significant challenge to this myth comes from the phenomenon of female mystics and visionaries. These numerous laywomen who never took vows as nuns achieved immense spiritual authority and widespread renown for their intense religious experiences, visions, and writings. Catherine of Siena, 14th century, a lay Dominican tertiary, was a prominent mystic, philosopher, and theologian who corresponded with popes and kings, offering spiritual and political advice. She played a crucial role in negotiating peace between Italian city-states and advocated for the return of the papacy from Avignon to Rome. Similarly, Bridget of Sweden, 14th century, a noblewoman and mother of 8, became a highly influential visionary whose revelations were widely disseminated and whose order, the Bridgetines, became widespread. Marjorie Kempe, 15th century, a laywoman from England, dictated an autobiography detailing her extensive pilgrimages and mystical experiences, which offers unique insights into lay piety and the challenges faced by women seeking religious authority outside conventional structures. These women, though not formally ordained, commanded immense spiritual respect and shaped religious discourse across Europe. These mystics and other pious laywomen often served as spiritual guides and counselors for both clergy and lay people, including powerful men. They preached, albeit informally, through their personal testimony and writings, and their devotion often inspired others. Some women, known as anchoresses, lived in solitary confinement attached to churches, dedicating their lives to prayer and spiritual counsel, acting as living saints for their communities. Julian of Norwich, 14th century, an anchoress, wrote profound theological treatises based on her visions, becoming one of the most important figures in English mysticism. Furthermore, medieval women actively participated in the creation and dissemination of devotional texts and religious art. They commissioned books of hours for personal prayer, owned Bibles and saints' lives in the vernacular, and created embroidery or illuminations with religious themes. This active engagement with sacred texts and images further demonstrates their profound personal religious lives beyond the formal structures of the church or the cloister. The evidence shows that medieval women were not confined to the status of passive observers in religious matters, but were active, influential, and diverse participants in the spiritual landscape of their era. Number 2, medieval women were always subservient and had no voice. The pervasive image of medieval women as universally silent, meek, and utterly subservient to men, without any personal voice or means of influence, is a significant oversimplification. This myth implies that women existed solely to obey, with no capacity for independent thought, expression, or challenge to patriarchal authority. While medieval society was undeniably patriarchal and structured to favor male dominance, historical evidence demonstrates that women across different social classes possessed and exercised their voices in various ways, often subtly, but sometimes overtly, shaping their lives and communities. Noblewomen, despite being subjects of arranged marriages, frequently wielded considerable influence within their households and at court. They managed vast estates, overseeing finances, servants, and agricultural production, particularly when their husbands were absent. This administrative role required a strong voice in directing staff and making economic decisions. Queens and duchesses often acted as regents, governing territories and administering justice in their husbands' names or during their sons' minorities. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 12th century, for example, was a powerful political figure who actively influenced court policy, led armies, and patronized the arts, demonstrating a powerful public voice. Blanche of Castile, 13th century, as Queen Regent of France, effectively ruled the kingdom, suppressed rebellions, and negotiated treaties, all requiring her to speak with authority and command. In the realm of courtly love, though an idealized literary convention, women were often depicted as the objects of male devotion and service, but also as figures of authority and inspiration. The lady's approval or disapproval could shape a knight's actions, granting her a symbolic, if not always literal, power over men. This literary tradition, while not reflective of everyday reality, suggests a cultural imagination where women held a degree of power in social interactions, particularly in elite circles. Beyond the nobility, women in towns and villages also found ways to make their voices heard. In guilds and trade associations, women often participated in meetings, managed businesses, and sometimes even held leadership positions, as seen in the Parisian Silk Weavers Guild. Their voices were crucial in economic decision-making and in regulating their crafts. Market women, innkeepers, and shopkeepers constantly interacted with the public, negotiating prices, resolving disputes, and asserting their business interests. Records from medieval urban courts show women bringing lawsuits, testifying as witnesses, and defending themselves against accusations, requiring them to articulate their cases and present their arguments effectively. For example, records from the Court of Husting in London reveal numerous instances of women participating in legal proceedings, speaking on their own behalf or through representatives. Within the family, while the husband was the legal head of the household, wives often exercised significant practical authority, especially in domestic management, child-rearing, and the moral upbringing of children. Their advice and counsel were often sought and valued within the family unit. Letters and household accounts from the later Middle Ages sometimes indicate wives making important decisions regarding family finances or estate management. For instance, the Paston Letters, a collection of correspondence from a 15th century English gentry family, show Margaret Paston actively managing the family estates, defending their property, and issuing instructions to her sons, demonstrating her formidable voice within the family and wider community. Even in religious contexts, women's voices rose to prominence. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, and Bridget of Sweden directly communicated with popes, emperors, and other powerful figures, offering advice, warnings, and critiques based on their spiritual visions. Their writings, which were widely circulated, represented powerful spiritual and intellectual voices that commanded respect across Europe. Anchoresses like Julian of Norwich offered spiritual counsel to those who sought it, their wisdom conveyed through their solitary existence and their profound theological writings. While formal political and legal structures largely favored men, medieval women were far from voiceless. They exercised influence through their economic activities, legal participation, household management, social interactions, and spiritual authority. Their voices, whether in the marketplace, the courtroom, the convent, or the private chambers of a castle, were instrumental in shaping their own lives and the broader society around them. The idea of universal subservience ignores the numerous ways women asserted their presence and agency. Number 1. Only noblewomen had any historical significance or documentation. A common oversight when discussing medieval women is the tendency to focus almost exclusively on the lives of noblewomen queens, duchesses, and ladies of the manor, leaving the impression that only women of high status had any historical significance or left behind any records. This myth suggests that the vast majority of medieval women, those from peasant, artisan, or merchant classes, were historically invisible, their lives unrecorded and therefore insignificant. However, while sources for noblewomen are indeed more plentiful, extensive documentation exists for women of all social strata, revealing their diverse and crucial roles in medieval society. Records of the vast majority of medieval women, the peasantry, can be found in manorial court rolls. These documents, kept by the lords of manors, detail the daily lives of villagers, including women. They show women participating in court proceedings, bringing complaints, defending themselves, inheriting land, buying and selling property, being fined for infractions, and witnessing documents. For instance, records from the manor of Wakefield in Yorkshire, spanning several centuries, contain thousands of entries mentioning peasant women by name, detailing their economic activities, family lives, and interactions with the legal system. These records demonstrate women's roles in agricultural labor, household management, and their legal standing within their communities. In urban areas, women from merchant, artisan, and laboring classes are documented in various sources. Guild records frequently list female members, apprentices, and wives inheriting or operating family businesses. City charters and ordinances mention women's roles in markets, their rights to trade, and their participation in urban life. For tax records, such as those from Florence or Norwich, enumerate female heads of households, business owners, and taxpayers, providing concrete evidence of their economic independence. The court records from borough courts and mercantile courts document women engaging in contracts, suing for debts, and settling disputes related to their trades. For example, records from the London Drapers Company in the 14th century specify rules for women's roles in the cloth trade. Ecclesiastical records provide insights into women across all social classes. Baptismal, marriage, and burial records, though often incomplete, track the lives of ordinary women. Wills and testaments, particularly from the later Middle Ages, are invaluable sources, as women from various backgrounds bequeath property, money, and personal items, offering glimpses into their material lives, family relationships, and personal piety. The records of ecclesiastical courts, which handled matters like marriage, divorce, slander, and moral offenses, frequently feature women as litigants, witnesses, and accused parties, giving voice to their personal grievances and disputes. A significant percentage of those involved in cases before these courts were women, providing direct evidence of their active participation in the legal and social fabric of their time. Archaeological evidence also sheds light on the lives of ordinary women. Findings from excavated medieval villages and towns, such as domestic tools, textiles, cooking utensils, and personal adornments, provide tangible evidence of women's daily activities, crafts, and living conditions. Skeletal remains can reveal information about diet, health, and physical labor, complementing written sources. Literary and artistic works, while often focusing on elite figures, also depict ordinary women in their daily lives. Manuscript illuminations, stained glass windows, and carvings show women working in fields, selling goods in markets, spinning, weaving, and engaging in various crafts, providing visual documentation of their roles. Ballads, songs, and folk tales, though sometimes fictionalized, often reflect the realities of common life, including the experiences of women. While the narratives of queens and saints are often grander and more accessible, the bulk of historical documentation for medieval women lies within the meticulous, if less glamorous, records of daily life. Manorial rolls, urban censuses, guild registers, court documents, and wills cumulatively paint a vibrant and detailed picture of women from all social strata, demonstrating that they were far from invisible and were integral to the economic, social, and cultural fabric of the medieval world. Their significance was not limited by their birth or wealth, and their lives are indeed well documented for those willing to look beyond the popular historical myths.